What is going on today, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk a little bit about EQ and specifically how I use EQ to get my heavy distorted guitar tracks to sound like this. First off, let me just preface the video by saying this. I am not a professional music producer. I just produce my own music tracks in my own music studio here. And I'm just giving you guys my personal experience of how I got a guitar tone like this. But specifically, I want to keep the conversation around the EQ and how I use it surgically to get the guitar tone to stand out, to be front and center, to be thick and full, and not have any harsh frequencies poking out. So that's the main purpose of this video. But I'm also going to show you guys the plugins that I use for this particular tone. If you're interested to see that, I'll go through that quickly at first. But yeah, basically this is an EQ video. Another thing I want to mention too is that obviously every guitar is going to sound different, every set of pickups, everything along the signal chain is going to play some degree of a factor into your final guitar tone that you hear coming out of your speakers or out of your headphones. I just want to show you guys how I use EQ to not destroy your tone, to not alter it so much so that it doesn't even sound like the fundamental tone you started out with. Because let's be honest, when you first turn on your amplifier or you first plug into your computer and turn on an amp sim and you dial in a tone that you like, you're doing it in solo, right? You're not doing it in a band situation. You're just doing what sounds good to you in the moment, in your room. So first off, I want to show you guys, all I did was double track these guitars, by the way. If I was going to release this song professionally on streaming platforms, I would probably quad track these guitars and or add a layer of synths underneath that's kind of duplicating what the guitar is playing as well to kind of really thicken it up and beef it up. But I didn't find it was necessary for this particular track. It just hits hard as is. So I just stuck with it. Double tracked is all we have here. So I'm using the exact same guitar tone for both left and right channel. I'm going to show you what I did on each track. So first off, I was using Schecter Sunset 6 guitar in drop C tuning for this song. And I was running through Archetype Nolly. And I'm going to show you guys how little I tweaked this tone from the original preset. So I have another instance of Archetype Nolly here. And the original preset here was one of Nolly's presets. In fact, it's his first preset called All-Purpose Metal Rhythm. And that's basically what I started off with. And you can see here, mine's on the left, the original's on the right. And the differences are so minute, there's very few. So first thing I notice here is that the treble, I dialed that back a little bit. The resonance I kept the same. The presence, I boosted a little bit. I felt like my guitar just needed more presence. And then I have slight alterations on the master and the output. Other than that, not much going on. As far as the pedals in the plugin itself, I kept the overdrive pedal, which is basically a simulation of a tube screamer, I think. And I did not change the settings from the original at all. Same thing can be said for the cab. I changed nothing there. And the EQ that's built into the plugin, I did add a low pass filter because I often do that. I always do that, in fact, with my guitar tones. I just felt like you don't need like 15 to 20K in your guitar tone. It's information that's too high and hissy. You don't hear half of it. And what you do hear is just so high up there, it's just annoying. So I cut that out. Otherwise, it was pretty much a stock tone. And before that, I have a simulation of what looks like a Horizon Devices precision drive. I can never say that word. Looks like that's what that is here. I've got the attack knob set to 3 out of, this one has 8 different positions. I think the original pedal has like 6 maybe. If you're familiar with this pedal, you know that the attack knob essentially is a high pass filter. So it pulls out low frequencies, the more you go more you go clockwise. So I have it at 3 and 0, drive is at 0, and lower the brightness a little bit. So not too much going on with that pedal. It's just tightening up the tone ever so slightly. So then we're going into Archetype Nolly, and then I'm going into my first instance of an EQ, which is just your stock. Here I've got a Logic plugin here, just stock EQ. And all I'm doing here apparently is a high pass at 64 hertz. Usually, I've said this before, usually my high passes are anywhere from like 60, maybe up to 100 hertz, depending on the type of tone you're going for. But I prefer to keep it lower rather than going too high, only because some of that low information does help fill out the mix ultimately. But you want to be careful that you're not letting too much sub come in and build up. So you often need to use dynamic EQ or dynamic compression somewhere in this low end to help quell or squash down your palm mutes, right? So we'll get to that in just a minute. But this first instance of my EQ, that's all that's going on there, nothing else. So then I've got both of these heavy rhythm tracks bussed to a summing track, basically a bus here, which I call heavy guitars. And that's where I first implement the EQ that I'm ultimately using to surgically pull out frequencies I don't like. After that, it's then going to my all rhythm guitars bus before it goes to the master out. And not much going on there. I do use this TDR Nova EQ there as a final just to kind of pull out. That's where I do dynamic EQ, because this TDR Nova it's a free one, a plugin, but it does a really hell of a good job at pulling out, for me, using it as a dynamic EQ to pull out some of the low woofiness that kind of builds up with your palm mutes. So that's basically all I'm pretty much using that for. Anyways, we're going to go back to the heavy guitar bus and talk about this EQ here specifically. Now, as far as being surgical with my moves, I'd rather do too little than too much, because I feel like when I do too much, you're just modifying or altering the original tone so much so that it's no longer what you started off with to begin with, which is what you kind of fell in love with, right? You find a preset and you tweak it to suit, and you're like, that's the tone I want to use. So altering it significantly with an EQ might fix issues, but then it's also going to make the guitar sit lower in the mix if you're doing a lot of reductive EQ. I don't do additive EQ here, generally speaking, because if I find the tone needs more of any frequencies, I'll go back to the original amp sim itself and kind of tweak the amp right there to boost stuff that I feel like it needs more of. So when I get to this part here, it's all subtractive EQ or reductive, either word works. And this is what I ultimately came up with here. And I'm going to show you guys another instance of this EQ. So we'll turn this one off. I'll pull up another EQ that is just default flat, nothing going on here. And we'll work on this one for a minute. So we're going to redo, basically, essentially, what I did in the other one, if that makes sense. I wouldn't recommend doing too much EQ or too much tone tweaking in solo, because that's not really telling you what it's going to sound like once it's in the full mix. You know, oftentimes you're going to pull out too much or not enough. So it really is beneficial to be EQing while you're listening to the full mix with the drums and the bass and whatever else is going on. So just for the moment, we'll do solo, okay? Just so we can hear what this sounds like with no EQ on it yet. All right, it doesn't sound bad, but there is some hissiness. There's some frequencies that we can clearly hear there that we don't want. So first off, what I always do to start off with my EQ is I'm going to do a high pass and a low pass, first of all. And again, I'm going to do too little rather than too much. So I'm always careful and cognizant of that. As for the slope, and I don't like to go too extreme because I just don't like how it sounds personally. So I keep it usually around 18, sometimes 24. Usually I don't go beyond 24. Then what I do is I like to go to extremes as far as the sweep is concerned, to hear what I'm cutting out, because sometimes your ear just, it tricks you after a while. You don't really know if you're hearing what you think you're hearing, if that makes sense. So if we listen to the tone in solo and I play with this sweep, you'll see what I mean. So as I sweep to the left and I let more of the low end in, you can hear it get fuller and a little warmer, and then it gets very subby eventually. So you want to find a nice balance there. And for me, like I said, it's usually somewhere in the range of like 65, 70 up to like maybe 100, but generally not, I don't want to go that high. I'd rather go lower, if anything, and leave more in. So let's see what I find right now. All right, so that seems like a good place to start. We'll leave that there for now. Now we're going to work on the high end. We're going to do the same thing. I usually set it to 18, and I'll go too far in so we can hear what we're adding back in as we roll it back. that seems like a good start there. Obviously, if you pull off too much of the high end, you're just burying the tone and it sounds very muddy and dull. So we don't want to do that. We want to keep a lot of presence and air because that's where the guitar lives anyways. It's all mid-range to upper mid-range is where you're going to hear it most in your mix. So I think before I was at like 9,900, but I think I'm hearing a little bit lower here for some reason, maybe 9,800, whatever. It's kind of nitpicking, but okay. So now that I've got my low pass and high pass kind of set, I'm going to begin to work on the mid frequencies, which is really where you hear the guitar most. So I'm going to grab this first node here on the interior of the EQ, and we're going to do the, you've seen this a million times before. You boost the frequency and you sweep it back and forth until you hear what annoying frequencies are standing out. Now, here is where the surgical part comes in from my experience. If I'm not hearing something, an annoying frequency at say 5, 6K, I'll boost it a little bit more. But generally speaking, I try to keep my dB boost for the sweep at like 10 dBs or less. If you have to go to extremes, like say you're going 12, 15, or all the way up to 24K or 24 dBs, it's going to sound terrible regardless because you're boosting it so much. So if you need to go that high, then it's not an annoying frequency and it's not significant enough in the tone to really need to be addressed. So like I said, I'll keep it below 10, maybe 6, 7, 8, somewhere in that range. And if you're hearing it right away at that level, you know you have to do something with it. Same thing can be said for the Q value. You don't want to go too narrow like this, and you don't want to go too wide, obviously, because you're going to hear everything. So everything's going to sound bad. When you go too narrow, I find that you may not even hear, audibly, the human ear is not going to pick up or distinguish the annoying frequency because there's so much distortion and harmonic content coming at you that trying to hear the one little frequency that in that narrow band, you're not going to hear it very well. So you want to set the Q value somewhere in the middle. I don't know, somewhere in the single digit range, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that range, something that's kind of an average amount of Q value. And then we're going to just do the sweep back and forth thing to see where we hear some annoying frequencies. I'll start on the high end and roll it back toward the low. We'll do that now. Okay, so first off, usually you're going to hear a lot of harsh frequencies anywhere between 1,500, 2K, up to about 4,500. Generally, I hear stuff between 2 and 4K. That's what bothers me the most. That's what just sticks out in my ears, and I just want to do my best to reduce it. But again, you don't want to do something huge where you're doing like this kind of a thing, and the Q value is gigantic, and that's just too much. You're just scooping out too much of the tone, which is you don't want to destroy the fundamental tone that you had to begin with, right? So surgical, small moves are better than too much. I'm going to pull this back, the Q value and the amount that I am reducing by until I just barely audibly hear the annoying frequency kind of fall back to the wayside. I don't want to go extreme. I don't want to go all the way down. There's no reason for all that. Just something, a little bit. So let's do this one more time. And, we'll try to find a couple of bad frequencies, and then I'll show you how I pull them out. All right, so that's the first one. I tend to hear a lot of nasty frequencies around 3,300 to 3,800. That stuff seems to bother me the most. So I just know I have to look in that area every time I do a new guitar tone. I'll start with the next note here, and then we will do the same thing. We'll find the next one that needs addressing. All right, already we're getting better here. So now that I've used a couple of nodes to pull out some of the high frequencies, I'm beginning to lose a little bit of the air and presence in the tone that I wanted to begin with. So now what I'll do is I'll add back in some of the high end with a high shelf. So when I start playing with the high shelf, what I like to do is I'll raise it up significantly, let's see, 4, 5, 6 dBs, and then I'll sweep it to the left until I find where it needs to be naturally, where it's not too much on the low end, but it's just enough presence that sounds right. Once I get that set, then I will pull the additive value back down. So if that makes sense. So we'll start off at something like this, and we'll just sweep it and see where we get. Okay, and when it comes to adding back in, I'm going to go really subtle. So for me, usually 1 to 2 dBs gain at the most, if not less. And then you can just toggle this on and off to see what the difference is, hear the difference. All right, that's starting to sound a lot better already. And so you can see what we've done so far. There's not much going on here. I am hearing a little bit of woofiness from the palm mutes, from the kind of the lower mids. So let's address that last and see what we can do to fix that. Now, that wasn't bothering me as much as the high frequencies were when they were poking out, so I'm not going to go as low with this here. I'm going to just go just subtly, maybe half a dB, 1.5 at the most. I don't want to completely neuter the tone. I still want to have some low end in the tone. I will address the palm mutes, like I said earlier, farther down the chain, to my final rhythm guitar bus using the dynamic EQ here, which you can see. And if I solo what we're pulling out, you can hear that too. So it's just barely catching those heavy build-up palm mute sounds, so they don't get too woofy and just too much resonance going on in the tone. I just want to just touch it a little bit with, like I said, dynamic EQ, dynamic compression, just pulling it back a little bit when those heavy palm mutes come in, but still retaining the fullness of the tone overall otherwise. EQ, it's all a personal thing. It's all subjective to what sounds best to your ears, obviously, what sounds best to your guitar tone in your track. But this is how I approach it. So I just want to show you guys how I think using EQ in a more surgical, precise way can really change the tone for the better without really altering it significantly from what it was to begin with, which is always what we try to achieve, right? So here is the EQ that we just did now, right, in real time. And I'll pull up the original one, put it side by side. This was my original EQ that I ended up ultimately using for this mix. That's the one on the left. The new one is on the right. Let's see what the differences are here, because I'm just curious. So originally, I was cutting the low end at 74 hertz. Here, I ended up going to 83.5, whatever. Not a lot different there. And then as far as the palm mutes, looks like I grabbed a little bit of 142. And over here, I was at 124. Okay. That's a little bit different, and every time you do this, it's going to be a little different. And we were just doing it in solo, by the way. We weren't doing it in the full mix. My ultimate EQ here that I stuck with was during listening to it in the full mix. So that's some of the differences too. On the high end, I cut originally 3420. Over here, it looks like I'm cutting 2360 and 3680. So I probably Could do a little more on the original one if I want to get a little more of the hissy fizziness out of there, but it just didn't feel like it needed it in the mix. My high shelf is at 2580. Here I am at 2560. That's pretty close considering I didn't memorize my original moves. I'm just redoing it in real time. That's pretty close. And then finally I was at a high pass at 9900. Here I'm at 9850. So those are pretty much almost the same too. So you can see that, you know, when you've done it enough times, you're going to come up with the same results for yourself more often than not. But yeah, surgical over being blunt force, just taking too much out of the signal, I think is best to maintaining a solid guitar tone. And I'm sticking to it. So that's my advice, guys. Take it or leave it. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. And if you do like this form of video where I talk about specifics of how I'm mixing, how I'm producing songs, let me know that too. That's pretty much it for today's video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Until next time, I'm out of here. See ya!